The great council chamber was silent except for the low hum of the star maps that floated in the air, and in the center of the map was a green-blue world that seemed almost peaceful, but the name under it made every alien in the room feel a cold weight in their chest, for the name was KL-47, and it was not a name said without fear, for every expedition sent to it had ended in silence and death. The eldest commander with silver ridges along his head spoke in a slow voice, saying, "No ship has returned from KL-47, not even a single escape pod, and every signal sent from the surface has ended in static and strange whispers. And yet there are those among us who still wish to go, for the surface is said to hold ancient ruins and metals that cannot be found anywhere else in the known galaxy, and if one could bring back even a fragment, they would be richer than an emperor." Around the table others shifted uncomfortably, for they had heard the same tales told in quiet corners of space stations and in the deep corridors of old ships, stories of forests that whispered in voices not made for the ears of any species of storms that could tear a ship apart before the crew even knew they were in danger, and of shapes moving in the mist too large and too strange to be any animal, yet too fast to be a machine. A younger officer named Relvan stood from his seat, his eyes bright with challenge, and said, "These are only old spacer tales told to frighten cadets and traitors. We are not children, and we should not fear the wind and the leaves, or the shadows and the fog. I will go, and I will return, and when I do, all will see that KL-47 is only a world like any other." A murmur ran through the council, some shaking their heads, and some whispering to each other, for they had seen the records of those who had gone before, and they knew the names of the lost ships carved into the black walls of the remembrance halls in the great stations above the core worlds. But Relvan was determined, and no voice could turn him from his path. The council debated for hours, weighing the lure of wealth and glory against the weight of risk and death, and in the end they voted to send another mission, for greed and pride are powerful, and the hope that someone might succeed where all had failed before is a seed that grows quickly in the hearts of those who dream of power. The day of departure came, and the crew gathered in the hangar bay under the cold light of the station lamps. The ship chosen was the Spear of Dawn, a sleek vessel armed for defense, but also equipped for deep exploration, its hull polished and shining like it had never known fear. But every mechanic and dock worker who watched them board knew that the shine of the hull would mean nothing on KL-47. As the great doors opened and the Spear of Dawn left the station, the crew looked out at the black sea of space and saw the green-blue world in the distance, growing larger with every passing hour, and some of them felt the weight of the warnings they had heard in whispers, but none spoke them aloud, for to speak fear is to give it strength. When they neared the world, the colors of the atmosphere swirled in strange patterns, almost as if the clouds were moving against the wind. Their scanners began to flicker with errors, and the communications officer frowned, saying, "There is static on every channel, and a sound like breathing, though no one is speaking, and we have no open line to any other ship." The commander ordered the crew to stay calm and focus on descent, but in the cockpit Relvan could feel something watching through the clouds, as if the planet itself knew they had come and was waiting for them, and though he told himself it was only the pull of gravity and the play of light in the mist, his heart beat faster in his chest. The ship passed through the first layers of cloud, and the static in their comms grew louder, now a slow, deep sound like the air moving in a vast cavern, and some of the crew shifted uneasily in their seats, and one whispered that it sounded like the breath of something sleeping far below. Relvan looked at the world on the screen ahead. Forests stretched for endless miles, broken only by black rivers that curved like veins through the land, and mountains rose like jagged teeth in the far distance, their peaks lost in heavy clouds, and for the first time he wondered if the old stories might not be only stories after all. The Spear of Dawn broke through the final layer of cloud, and the land rushed up to meet them. The sunlight was pale and cold, and the air shimmered strangely around the hills below, and the static in their comms changed into a slow rhythm that was not machine noise and was not wind, and every person on the ship felt the hair rise on their neck, as if something unseen had turned its face toward them. And then in the silence before landing they all heard it clearly for the first time, a breath long and slow and close, and not belonging to anyone aboard. The ship touched down on the surface with a soft shudder as the landing struts sank slightly into the soil, which felt looser than normal, as if it had been turned and stirred many times before by something far larger than the crew could imagine, and when the engines cooled and the hatch opened, the air that came inside was unlike any they had breathed before, for it was fresh and sweet, yet carried a faint smell of something damp and ancient, as if the ground itself had been holding its breath for a long time and had only now decided to exhale. Relvan stepped out first, his boots sinking slightly into the soft ground, and his visor showed readings that puzzled him, for the oxygen levels were higher than expected, and the wind moved gently, yet the direction of the movement shifted, without warning, like a tide that did not follow the pull of any moon, and the golden light of the sun was not warm, but cool against his skin, as if filtered through water, though there was no ocean in sight. Around them the forest rose high, with trunks twisted like ropes and leaves that shimmered with a faint metallic sheen, and each time the wind passed through them, they made a soft sound, not like rustling, but more like whispering voices speaking words that none of the crew understood, yet could almost feel in their bones, and one of the scouts named Farron muttered through the calms that it felt as if the trees were talking about them rather than to them. The crew spread out in formation with scanners held high, and weapons ready, though the scanners displayed nothing larger than the size of a small bird, and there were no thermal signatures of predators in the area, yet the ground kept giving a faint vibration under their boots, as if something far away was moving in slow circles beneath the soil, and one of the engineers glanced at Relvan and gave a small shake of his head, as if to say something here is not right. Relvan ignored the unease and ordered the crew to plant the first set of beacons around the landing site, so they would have a safe perimeter, and the crew moved quickly, setting the tall, thin devices into the soil and activating their signal lights. But almost immediately after the beacons were set, their signal on the ship's sensors began to flicker in and out, and a few moments later the first beacon toppled slowly into the earth, as if the ground had swallowed its base, and by the time two soldiers reached it, the beacon was gone, leaving only a small depression in the soil, with loose dirt still falling into it. This strange event repeated again and again as the other beacons sank into the ground in silence, each one disappearing without any sign of force or damage, and the crew began to speak in sharper voices over the calms, as if to keep their fear away through noise, but the forest around them stayed quiet, with the same slow whispering of leaves that had never stopped since they arrived, and it began to feel as if the sound had been there even before they had landed, waiting for them to hear it. The commander ordered them to push deeper into the forest in hopes of reaching higher ground for a better view, and so they moved forward along a faint trail where the undergrowth seemed to part slightly as they walked, though no one could agree if it had been there before or if it was forming ahead of them, and the trees grew closer together, the light filtering through their leaves, turning dim and green like the bottom of a deep lake, and the air took on a heavier weight that made each breath feel slower. As they walked, the footsteps of the crew echoed strangely, and more than one soldier noticed that sometimes, when they stopped, they could still hear another set of steps stopping a moment later, as if someone or something was following just out of sight. But whenever they turned, there was nothing except the tall trunks and the glimmer of strange eyes on the higher branches that would vanish before the crew could focus on them. One of the scouts released a small drone to survey ahead, and it rose smoothly through the dim canopy. But only moments later the video feed began to distort, with static lines crawling across the image, and then the picture went black, and the sound that came through the feed was a slow, deep sigh like something old and tired before the signal died entirely, and the drone fell from the air, landing somewhere unseen in the forest with a muffled thud. Relvan told the crew to keep moving and keep their weapons ready, and they reached a small clearing where the ground felt firmer, and the sun touched the soil in narrow beams that made the leaves glow faintly like thin glass. And here they stopped to take samples of the plants and the soil, but when the science officer bent down to collect a handful of dirt, she froze and whispered that the soil was warm, as if something alive had been resting just under the surface only moments before. The commander ordered everyone to remain alert, and the crew began marking the clearing for further study, but as they worked, the edges of the clearing seemed to darken slightly, as if shadows were creeping inward from the trees, though there was no change in the position of the sun, and the whispering leaves grew louder, now, like 100 quiet voices speaking over one another without pause. Suddenly one of the soldiers at the edge of the clearing called out in alarm, for he had seen something move between the trees, and when the others turned they caught only the briefest glimpse of a tall shape vanishing into the green gloom, its outline strange and bent and far taller than any person, and its movement so fluid that it seemed to slide rather than step, and no one could say if it had eyes, but all agreed that they had felt it looking at them. The crew tightened their formation and began a slow retreat toward the landing site, but when they checked their path, behind them the faint trail they had followed here was gone, replaced by thick undergrowth and twisted roots, as if the forest had closed itself after letting them in and now had no intention of letting them leave, and the vibrations under the soil were stronger now, like the faint rhythm of something vast shifting in its sleep beneath the ground. The commander tried to call the ship for a location ping, but the signal was only static, and within the static there was a low, slow sound almost like a drawn-out breath. And as the crew listened, it began to match the rhythm of the vibrations in the soil, and every person there understood, without needing to say it aloud, that they were not alone, and whatever was here had already noticed them. The shadows at the edge of the clearing deepened, and the whispering rose to a soft chorus, and Relvan found his hand tightening on his weapon, though he did not raise it, for some part of him felt that to point a weapon into the forest would be to break a rule he did not understand. And as he stood there, the thought came unbidden into his mind that the forest was waiting for something. And then the ground shifted beneath their feet in a slow rolling wave that made the trees sway though there was no wind, and the commander gave the order to move. But before they could take a single step, a low voice, unlike any they had ever heard, spoke from the shadows at the far side of the clearing, saying, "You should not have come here." The voice that spoke from the shadows was deep and slow, and it rolled through the clearing like a cold wind, carrying with it a weight that made the crew freeze. Where they stood for a moment, no one moved, no one spoke, and the only sound was the endless whispering of the leaves high above and the slow, heavy vibration under the ground. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, the voice was gone, leaving only the feeling that something had stepped away, but had not gone far. The commander signaled for the crew to fall back in tight formation, and they began to move cautiously toward the direction they believed the landing site to be. But every path seemed different now, and the trees stood closer together than before, their twisted trunks leaning in as if to watch the strangers walking beneath them, and the golden light that had touched the ground earlier was gone, replaced by a dim green glow that seemed to come from the leaves themselves, and it cast strange shadows that moved even when the crew stood still. As they walked, the crew kept glancing over their shoulders, for they could not shake the sense of being followed, and though they never saw anything clear, there were flashes of movement between the tree shapes that slid behind trunks before eyes could focus, shapes too tall to be human, too thin to be an animal, and their steps never made a sound. The crew tried to keep their pace steady, but the ground began to change, becoming softer and uneven, and several times the soldiers' boots sank deep into the soil, as if it had no bottom, and when they pulled free, the ground closed again without a trace. And it was during one of these moments that the first disappearance happened, for one soldier lagged just a step behind to pull his foot free, and when the others turned to check on him, there was only an empty space. Where he had stood, the soil untouched, the air still. They called his name through the comms, but there was no answer, only the faint static that had been there since they landed. And after a moment the commander ordered them to keep moving, for to stay in one place felt more dangerous than pressing forward, and so they did, but unease had now settled over them like a second skin, and every shadow seemed longer, every whisper sharper. Not long after the first loss came the second. This time the crew was crossing a shallow dip in the ground where the light was almost gone, and the air smelled faintly of metal, and one of the scouts, walking on the left flank, simply vanished between one step and the next, without cry, without struggle, without a sign that he had ever been there at all. The crew swept the area with their scanners, but the readings were the same as always: no large life signs, no unusual energy, yet they all knew the readings were wrong, because something here was moving with them unseen. The commander increased their pace, trying to reach a ridge that they could see through a break in the trees, for higher ground might give them a better chance to orient themselves, but the forest seemed determined to delay them, for roots rose like coils from the ground to block their steps, and branches shifted down, as if reaching toward their heads, and each time they cut through the plants the pieces would twist and curl as if alive, and the gap they made would close before the last of the crew could pass through. When they finally reached the base of the ridge, the air grew colder and the ground firmer, but the feeling of being watched had not faded, and in fact it deepened, for now it was as if something stood just behind them, breathing slowly in rhythm with the earth itself. And it was then that the third disappearance occurred, for the science officer, who had been scanning the ridge, turned to speak to Relvan, and found herself standing alone, the soldier she had been beside moments ago, gone without even the shift of a shadow to mark it. Fear was now in every voice, though they tried to keep it from the comms, and the commander ordered them to climb the ridge quickly. But as they began to ascend, the earth trembled in a long, slow wave, and from somewhere deep in the forest came a low sound like a drumbeat, so heavy it seemed to thud inside their bones, and the whispering of the leaves rose in answer, until it was almost like chanting, though the words, if they were words, were still unknown to any of them. Halfway up the ridge, the fourth disappearance happened, this time with eyes upon it, for a soldier near the rear of the group suddenly stiffened as if gripped by something unseen, and then was pulled backward into the air, his body vanishing into the shadows between two trees, as if swallowed by water, and the space where he had gone closed like nothing had passed through, and the crew moved faster, now driven by the knowledge that whatever hunted them could take them even in sight of the others. At the top of the ridge they found a small flat space with a view over the forest, and here for the first time they could see how vast it was, stretching farther than the eye could follow, with no sign of their landing site or any break in the green canopy below. But what drew their eyes most was not the forest itself, but the shapes moving within it, for in the distance entire sections of the canopy shifted, as if something huge and many-limbed was moving beneath the trees, and wherever it passed the leaves seemed to bow toward it as if in respect or fear. The crew stood frozen by the sight, and in that moment the fifth disappearance came silently and without warning, for one of the engineers, who had been standing near the edge, simply was not there anymore, and it was Relvan who noticed first a shout breaking the spell that had held them still, and the commander gave the order to descend the other side of the ridge in hopes of finding another route back to the ship, for to remain here seemed certain death. They began the descent quickly, but the path down was slick with moss and narrow, and the air here was heavier, as if pressing down on them, and though no one spoke, it seemed to all of them that the forest itself was guiding their steps, now turning them toward some place unseen and unwanted. And the sixth disappearance happened before they reached the base, for a scout at the front gave a sharp cry, and then his voice cut off mid-word, his body gone, leaving only his dropped scanner on the path. The remaining crew was now less than half of those who had left the ship, and their voices were tight and clipped over the comms as they moved through the dimness, the whispering leaves above now joined by a faint low hum that seemed to come from the ground itself, and though they tried not to look, they could see movement to either side, shadowy figures pacing them step for step just beyond the reach of light. When they finally reached the base of the ridge, they found themselves in a narrow hollow, where the ground was bare of plants and the soil was dark and wet, and in the center of this hollow was a circle of stones worn smooth and half sunken into the earth, and before they could question it, the vibrations under their feet surged, and the air grew warm and heavy, and something began to rise slowly from the soil within the circle. The crew stood frozen, weapons half raised, as the dark shape grew taller, its surface glistening with wet earth, and though it had no clear form, it seemed to have too many limbs, and its presence pressed against their minds like the weight of deep water. And then a voice spoke again, the same voice they had heard before, low and slow and close, saying, "You will not leave." The voice that rolled through the hollow was heavy and slow, and seemed to come from everywhere at once, pressing into the ears of every crew member like the deep echo of a cave far beneath the ground. And as it spoke, the shape in the circle of stones began to move with a slow, terrible grace, its limbs unfolding in ways that no living thing should move, each one too long, too thin, too flexible, and the glistening surface of its body caught the faint green light from the forest above, making it seem as if it were woven from wet leaves and dark roots, and the air grew warmer with each second it stood there. Relvan felt the weight of its gaze, though it had no eyes he could see, and his hand tightened on his weapon, but some deep part of him whispered that no weapon they carried could harm something like this, and when the commander raised his arm to give the signal to fire, the ground trembled with a low pulse that made every soldier stagger, and in that moment the creature was gone from the circle, as if it had never been there, yet the air still carried the heat of its presence, and the soil where it had stood steamed faintly, as if scorched from within. A sudden sound broke the stillness, the crunch of leaves behind them, and the crew turned as one to see another shape moving between the trees, this one lower to the ground, but no less strange, with limbs that bent in more than one direction, and a head that shifted and twisted, as if searching for the best angle to see them, and its movement was silent except for the sound of leaves parting, yet the sound seemed to come from many directions at once, as if there were more than one of them, though none could be seen. The commanders shouted for the crew to form a defensive circle, and they obeyed, their weapons raised, their eyes scanning the trees, but the shadows between the trunks deepened and began to flow, as if the darkness itself were shifting closer, and in that thickening dark they caught glimpses of other shapes moving quick and low, too quick to aim at, and each time a figure passed between the trees, the whispering above grew louder until it felt like a storm of voices just beyond hearing. Without warning, one of the soldiers at the edge of the formation gave a sharp gasp and fell to his knees, his body jerking, as if gripped by invisible hands, and before anyone could reach him, he was pulled backward into the shadows, his weapon clattering to the ground and vanishing in the gloom, and a moment later another soldier cried out, firing wildly into the dark, but the shot struck only tree bark and moss, and then he too was gone, taken with a speed that made the air snap. Relvan's heart pounded, and his visor display flickered with static and strange lines of unreadable text, like the system was trying to show something it could not comprehend, and then a shape lunged from the dark toward the group, a blur of limbs and teeth that glistened in the green light. But before it could strike, it stopped just short, as if testing their reactions, and the sound it made was not a growl or a hiss, but a slow, deep inhale that seemed to draw the warmth from the air. The commander ordered them to move toward the opposite slope of the hollow, hoping the creatures would not pursue beyond its boundary, and they began to back away, weapons aimed at the shifting shadows, but the darkness moved with them, keeping pace, and every few steps another low shape would dart forward, only to vanish again, just at the edge of sight, and the vibrations under the ground returned in long, slow pulses that matched the rhythm of the inhaling sound from the unseen predator. They reached the slope and began to climb the wet earth, slipping under their boots, and as they did, one of the scouts at the rear stumbled, and before he could rise, a long, thin limb shot from the shadows, wrapping around his leg and pulling him down into the dark soil, as if the earth itself had opened for him, and his voice was cut short with a wet, choking sound, and then there was only the soft hiss of shifting dirt closing again. The crew scrambled up the slope, moving faster now, fear giving them strength, and when they reached the top, they found themselves on another ridge, looking down into a wider clearing where the light was strange, almost golden, and in the center of that clearing stood a figure so out of place it made every alien stop for a heartbeat, for it was a human. He stood with his back to them, wearing no armor, no visible weapon, only a worn pack on his shoulders and a walking stick in his hand, and he seemed utterly calm, as if standing in a place he knew well, and when he turned to look at them his expression held no fear, only the faintest hint of annoyance, as if they had interrupted his quiet moment. Relvan called out to him, demanding to know how he had survived here, and the human shrugged, saying in a voice that carried easily across the space that this was just a nice place for a weekend walk, and he had been coming here for years, though he added that it was not a good idea for strangers to wander without knowing the rules, and when asked what rules, he simply looked past them toward the hollow they had just fled, and said quietly that the ground wakes up when it feels too many footsteps in one place. The commander tried to question him further, but the human simply waved them to follow, turning to walk toward the far side of the clearing, and each step he took seemed deliberate, as if he knew exactly where to place his feet, and Relvan noticed that the shadows at the edge of the clearing did not follow him, nor did the whispering of the leaves seem as loud near him, and it was then that Relvan realized this man had learned how to move through this place without being claimed by whatever hunted here. Yet even as they followed, a sound rose from behind them, a roar so deep it made the ridge under their feet tremble, and the human stopped mid-step, his shoulders stiffening, and for the first time his calm expression faded, replaced by something colder and sharper, and he muttered almost to himself that this was not the ground this time. The roar came again, louder and closer, and the shadows in the trees seemed to boil outward as if driven before some greater presence, and the whispering of the leaves turned into a rushing sound like wind, though the air was still, and the human turned to face them, his voice low but urgent, telling them to keep their weapons ready, though it would not matter much if they were too slow, and as the crew shifted into a tense formation, Relvan felt the ground beneath him pulse, once, twice, and then go still, in a way that made the silence feel worse than the roar. From the far side of the ridge, the trees began to part, bending away, as if pushed by an invisible force, and the light in that direction dimmed as something massive approached, its shape hidden by the thick mist that rolled in ahead of it, and though no one could yet see it clearly, they could feel its size in the way the earth bowed slightly with each step, and in the way the air grew heavy in their lungs. The human raised his walking stick, holding it across his body not as a weapon, but as if marking some invisible line between them and what was coming, and his voice, when he spoke again, was almost a whisper, saying, "Whatever you do, do not run." The human stood still on the ridge, his walking stick planted lightly into the soil, his gaze fixed on the shifting mist ahead, and the crew felt something in his stillness that made them uneasy, for it was not fear, and it was not carelessness. It was the kind of calm that came from someone who had been here before many times, and had lived through things they could not imagine. And when the commander stepped forward to ask again what they were facing, the human only tilted his head slightly and said, "Quietly, you will see soon enough, but when you do, you must remember the one thing I tell you. Now, do not run." The sound from beyond the mist was growing heavier, a slow, deep beat that might have been footsteps, or might have been the pounding of something even more vast, something moving in a way that shifted the ground in slow waves, and with each pulse the air grew warmer, until it carried a scent that was not rot, and not metal, but something older, a smell like the inside of a cavern that had been sealed for centuries, only now open to the air. Relvan kept his weapon raised, though part of him knew it would be as useless as a stick against a storm, and his visor showed only a blur where the mist moved, though every few moments a shadow far too large to be any normal creature passed within it, and the human's eyes followed those shapes with the sharp focus of a hunter who knew exactly what he was watching and exactly how close it could come before striking. The mist began to thin in places, revealing the edges of enormous roots pushing up from the soil and curling back down again as if breathing, and from between them a shape emerged slowly, at first only a suggestion of movement, but then the curve of a limb longer than a tree trunk sliding forward, the surface covered in moss and patches of pale bark that shifted and flexed like skin, and above that the suggestion of a head, though its shape was all wrong too, flat, too wide, too full of ridges and hollows that seemed to open and close like the gills of a deep ocean creature. The crew tightened their formation, and the commander hissed for them to hold position, though his voice carried the strain of someone fighting the urge to run, and the human glanced back at them with a faint smile that held no humor, and said again in that low, steady tone, "Do not run, because it likes to chase, and when it does, it will not stop until every one of you is gone." The creature stepped further into view, and now they could see that it was not separate from the forest, but part of it, its limbs merging with trees, its skin patterned with vines and branches that grew directly from it, and in its movement there was a strange slow grace, like the turning of a tide, and yet every step carried the promise of crushing force, and when it turned its head toward them, they saw that it had eyes deep set and glowing faintly green like stones, lit from within, and those eyes fixed not on the group as a whole, but on each one in turn, lingering just long enough to make them feel weighed and measured. The human shifted his walking stick and began to move slowly along the ridge, not toward the creature, but at an angle away from it, and as he moved he spoke over his shoulder, telling them to match his pace exactly, not faster, not slower, and to place their feet only where his had been before. And Relvan almost asked why, but something in the human's tone told him that this was not a request, and so he followed, and the rest followed him, and as they moved, the creature's gaze stayed locked on them, but it did not advance, though the ground beneath it flexed and pulsed like the surface of a great heart. They moved in silence, except for the whisper of leaves above, and the slow, steady beat of the creature's movements, and each step felt like walking on the edge of some vast drop, where one wrong motion would send them falling, and Relvan found himself counting the rhythm of the humans, steps matching it as closely as he could, and feeling the strange stillness in the air when he did. And in that stillness, he began to realize that the forest was listening not just to the creature, but to them, to the way they moved, to the way they breathed. After what felt like a long time, the human stopped beside a low outcrop of stone half covered in moss, and crouched down, tapping the surface lightly with his stick, then brushing away the moss to reveal a narrow crack in the rock. He motioned for them to follow and slip inside one by one the gap, just wide enough to squeeze through, and on the other side, they found themselves in a narrow passage that wound down into the earth, the walls damp and smelling of old stone and wet roots. Once they were inside, the human was the last to enter, and he pulled a length of woven vine from his pack, pressing it into the crack, and muttering something under his breath, and almost at once the air in the passage grew cooler, the whispering of the leaves fading into nothing, and the slow, deep beat of the creature's steps vanishing as if it had turned away, though no one had seen it move, and the commander asked him what he had done, but the human only shrugged, saying, "This place is old enough that it does not hear us here," and that was enough to keep it away for now. They followed the twisting path of the tunnel deeper until it opened into a chamber lit by a faint glow from crystals set into the walls, and here the human set down his pack and leaned on his stick, looking at each of them in turn before speaking in a voice that carried no mockery, only quiet fact, saying, "You are not the first to come here, and you will not be the last. Every other group thought they could fight the land or outthink it, but KL-47 is alive in ways you cannot yet understand. It is patient and it is curious, but it does not forget, and when it decides you belong to it, nothing you carry will save you." Relvan asked why he came here if it was so dangerous, and the human's mouth curved slightly in something almost like a smile as he answered that some places cannot be left alone, some places call to certain people, and some people learn how to walk the paths without waking what sleeps beneath them. And then his eye sharpened, and he said, "And now you must learn too, because the ground will wake again soon, and when it does, the only question is whether it will decide. You may leave, or whether you will stay forever like the rest." The crew shifted uneasily, and the commander asked what the human meant by the rest, but before he could answer, a sound came, faint at first like a distant sigh, but growing slowly deeper and louder until it seemed to press into the stone walls, and dust drifted from the ceiling, and the human picked up his stick, slinging his pack over his shoulder, and saying quietly, "We are out of time." The sound in the tunnel swelled like a deep breath drawn by something vast and unseen, and the wall seemed to tremble, as if the stone itself were shifting in response. And the human's voice stayed calm, but his steps quickened as he led them through a narrow bend in the passage and upward toward a faint light, far ahead, his stick tapping the ground in a steady rhythm that the crew instinctively matched their own footsteps, falling into the same pace, as if the sound itself could hide them from whatever was stirring beyond the walls. The air grew warmer with each step, and carried with it a scent that was not of the forest above, but something older and stranger, a mix of damp earth and stone long buried, and faintly sweet, as if flowers no one had ever seen were blooming somewhere in the dark, and Relvan's skin prickled as he felt the ground beneath his boots shift almost imperceptibly like muscle beneath flesh, and he realized that the earth here was not still, it was never still. They emerged into a wide cavern lit by the same pale crystals as before, but here they were larger, growing from the walls and ceiling like frozen lightning, their faint glow casting long shadows across the uneven floor, and in the center of the cavern a pool of dark water lay perfectly still, as if waiting, and the human crossed to its edge without hesitation, crouching down to touch the surface with his fingers, and when he did, the ripples moved outward, not in circles, but in strange lines that curved and twisted before vanishing into nothing. The commander asked sharply what was happening, but the human did not look up. He only said, "The ground is waking faster than I thought, and now it knows where we are," and as if in answer, the water in the pool began to rise, not like it was filling, but as though something beneath it was pushing upward, and small rivulets of soil began to slide from the walls into the pool, disappearing without a trace. A sudden deep vibration rolled through the cavern, and the crystals flickered their glow, dimming for a heartbeat before returning stronger. And in that dimming, Relvan saw movement in the shadows along the far wall, long route, like shapes, sliding slowly upward, curling along the stone, and branching into smaller tendrils that quivered in the air like they were testing for scent. And when the light returned, the shapes froze, but he knew they were still there, still reaching. The human rose and motioned for them to follow a narrow path that wound along the edge of the pool and into a dark passage on the far side, saying quietly, "We need to be above ground before it decides to close its eyes again, because if it does, we will never leave." And his tone carried no urgency in its sound, but the speed of his steps told another story, and they followed close behind, the sound of the water fading behind them. The passage was tight, and the air thicker here, and the ground sloped steadily upward, but every so often the walls would quiver with a faint pulse, and each time They did. The human would pause, listening, as though to some voice none of them could hear, and then choose the next turn, without hesitation, and Relvan began to realize that the man was not simply guiding them out. He was moving in a pattern, avoiding certain paths, as if they were traps laid not for the feet, but for the mind itself. After what felt like an hour, though the human had said time did not matter here, they came to a point where the passage split into 3 narrow tunnels, and from the leftmost came a soft rhythmic sound, almost like a heartbeat. From the rightmost came a faint rustling like leaves brushing together in wind, and from the center came nothing at all, and without a pause the human chose the center and stepped inside the darkness, swallowing him, and one by one they followed. The tunnel curved sharply, and then the air changed, growing cooler and cleaner, and far ahead a faint golden light began to appear, flickering like sunlight through leaves, and the human slowed his steps, now telling them to listen carefully, and when they strained their ears, they could hear it too, the soft whispering they had first heard when they landed above, but here it was louder and more focused, as if directed straight toward them, and the words, though still not understood, seemed closer to meaning, and Relvan felt a chill as he thought the forest itself might be speaking. They emerged into a narrow ravine, its walls high and overgrown with moss and ferns, and above them the canopy of the forest filtered the sun into shifting patterns of gold and green, and for a moment the sight felt almost peaceful, but the human did not stop moving, leading them quickly along the ravine floor, and explaining in a low voice that once the ground is fully awake, it will not use shadows and whispers to move. It will bring the roots and the limbs and the breath of the deep earth itself, and when that happens, there will be no safe place. As they moved through the ravine, Relvan noticed that the moss on the walls was trembling slightly, not from wind, for there was none, but in time with the deep pulses they had felt below, and then small pieces of it began to fall away, revealing beneath it the same root-like shapes he had seen in the cavern, now pushing outward, curling toward the path. And the human quickened his pace, his walking stick striking the stones harder, as if to drown out some sound they could not hear. They rounded a bend and found themselves facing a wall of twisted branches and vines that had grown together into a solid barrier, and the commander cursed under his breath, but the human only tapped his stick 3 times against the ground and waited, and slowly the vines began to shift, pulling aside to reveal a narrow opening just wide enough for them to pass through one by one, and as Relvan stepped through, he felt the vines brush against his armor with a strange, deliberate slowness, as if tasting the surface before letting him go. Beyond the barrier the forest opened into a wide glade, the sunlight here brighter though still pale, and the air still and heavy, and in the center of the glade the ground was bare of grass or roots, only dark soil marked with long shallow depressions, like the tracks of something immense moving in slow circles, and the human stopped at the edge, his face unreadable, and said softly, "This is where it rises, when it wants to see for itself, and I think today it will rise soon." Even as he spoke, the ground in the center began to swell in a slow rolling motion, and the soil split along the shallow tracks, revealing glimpses of pale root and stone, and something else beneath, something vast and layered that shifted like muscle, and Relvan felt the air grow warmer, heavier, as the swell grew larger and larger, until it filled half the glade, and from deep within came a sound that was not a roar, not a growl, but something between a sigh and a word in a language none of them knew. The human turned to them, eyes sharp and voice quiet, saying, "We are going to walk out of here now, and we are going to do it without running, without stopping, and without looking back, no matter what you hear. And if you cannot do that, then you will stay here and become part of it like the others." And then, without another word, he stepped forward onto the bare soil, his feet moving in a steady rhythm, and the crew followed, because there was nothing else they could do, and with each step the ground trembled beneath them, as if considering whether to let them pass or to close over them forever. The human walked with the same steady rhythm across the bare soil, each step falling as if it had been measured and placed long before, and the crew followed, trying to match his pace, though their legs ached and their lungs burned from the heavy air, and with every step the ground beneath them flexed, as if breathing, and they could feel the pull of something deep below, as though the earth itself were aware of their weight, and considering whether to let them go or draw them under, into whatever lay hidden beneath. Around them the glade was silent, yet filled with movement. In the edges of their vision the shadows shifted and curled, and the pale roots that had been buried moments before were sliding upward to coil in the air like the limbs of some great sleeping beast stretching toward waking, and each time the human placed his stick on the ground, they would hesitate and lower again, as if unwilling to cross the line of sound he made, and Relvan began to understand that. The rhythm was not random, it was a signal, something the land itself recognized and obeyed. Halfway across the glade the ground swelled again, a slow rolling motion that made the soil ripple under their boots, and from the crest of that swell a shape began to rise, at first no more than a shadow within the earth, but then the lines of it became clear, a form vast and many-limbed, its body seeming to be woven of the same roots and stones that lay all through the forest, and yet moving with the fluidity of a living creature. And when its head lifted, the green glow of its eyes burned brighter than the filtered sunlight above, and those eyes fixed upon them one by one, lingering long enough that each person felt the weight of its attention in their chest. The commander's hand twitched toward his weapon, but the human's voice cut through the air, sharp and quiet at the same time, telling him not to move, not to raise it, not to speak. And the tone carried such absolute certainty that the commander froze where he stood and lowered his hand again, his jaw tight, and his eyes locked on the glowing gaze of the thing before them. The creature did not advance, but the earth around it shifted as if the entire glade were alive and watching, and the human stepped forward one pace and lowered his head slightly, in something that was not a bow and not submission, but an acknowledgement, and in that moment the air changed, growing cooler, and the weight on their chests eased, and the creature's limbs slowly sank back into the soil until only the faint glow of its eyes remained above the surface, fading as it withdrew and the swell of the earth settled into stillness. They crossed the last stretch of soil and stepped into the shadow of the trees once more, and Relvan realized that his hands were shaking, though he had not fired a shot nor raised his weapon, and when he looked back across the glade it was as if nothing had happened, the soil smooth and still, the tracks gone, and the sunlight pale and cold, once more filtering down without warmth. The human did not look back, he only kept walking deeper into the forest, though this time the trees seemed to part for him, their twisted trunks leaning away from his path, and the whispering of the leaves softening until it was no more than a faint rustle at the edge of hearing, and the crew followed, because they could not imagine finding their way alone through this place, now that they had seen what lay beneath it. After a long silence the commander asked what the thing in the glade was, and the human answered without turning his head that it was KL-47, not just the forest, not just the ground, but the entire world, every root, every stone, every drop of water, part of the same living mind, and it had watched every step they had taken since the moment they landed. And when asked why it had spared them, he only said that it was curious, and curiosity was the only reason anyone ever left this place alive. Relvan asked how long the human had been here, and the man's mouth curved in the faintest of smiles as he replied, long enough to learn its moods and its rules, long enough to know when to walk and when to stand still, long enough to see every other visitor disappear into the soil without a sound. And when Relvan pressed him on why he stayed, the human shrugged, saying some places choose you, and once they do, you can never really leave. They walked for what felt like hours, though the light above never changed, and eventually the forest thinned, and the ground grew firmer under their feet, and in the distance, through a gap in the trees, they saw the dull glint of the spear of dawn, still resting where they had left it, though the beacons they had planted were gone without trace, and the air around the landing site felt different, heavier, as if the world were leaning in to listen to what they would do next. At the edge of the clearing the human stopped and turned to face them, his gaze steady as he told them that if they left now, they must never return, not with ships, not with soldiers, not with machines, to strip the land, because the next time KL-47 woke, it would not be curious, it would be certain, and when it was certain, nothing in the galaxy could stop it from keeping what it wanted. And then he stepped back into the forest without waiting for an answer, his figure fading into the green shadows until he was gone. The crew crossed the clearing in silence and boarded the ship, their movements slow and careful, as if afraid that even the vibration of the engines might stir the thing below. And when the spear of dawn rose into the sky, Relvan looked down at the forest, one last time, seeing nothing but the endless canopy of leaves, and yet feeling the weight of those unseen eyes watching them, until the clouds closed over and the world was lost from view. In the quiet hum of the ship as they left orbit, the commander ordered the log sealed and marked with the highest level of restriction, and when one of the remaining crew asked if they would report the location to the council, the commander's voice was flat and final, saying no, because the only thing more dangerous than what lived on KL-47 would be the greed of those who thought they could take it and survive, and no one spoke after that. Relvant sat in his seat staring at the empty starfield ahead, and thinking of the man with the walking stick, and the way the forest had moved aside for him, and he wondered whether the human had truly chosen to stay, or whether the world had chosen him, and he knew that question would follow him for the rest of his life. And perhaps that was the true power of KL-47, not that it killed without trace, but that for those who escaped it never really let them go. Far below, unseen beneath layers of soil and stone and root, the slow, deep pulse of the world continued steady as the beat of a heart waiting and listening.